Welcome to this big interview episode of Green Signals with a special guest who needs no introduction whatsoever, but we will give him one. Before we get to that, though, the big news of last week was the launch on the 20th of February, to much fanfare by the Department of Transport at least, of the Rail Reform Bill. Yet whilst the DfT was very excited, the wider reaction has been mixed, to say the least. So we thought, who better to chat about the Rail Reform Bill than the person who has led the GBR transition team for the last couple of years and will be the person implementing whatever it is that comes out of the end of this process. So our special guest today is that person, and we are delighted to welcome Andrew Haines, Chief Executive of Network Rail. Andrew, welcome to Green Signals. It's really good of you to carve out some time in what I know is a hectic schedule to come and chat, and we know your time's tight today. So let's get straight into it.
Thank you for the invitation, both of you.
You're very welcome. It's a delight to have you here, Andrew. Can we at least dispel a bit of my confusion about GBR? Mm-hmm. It's been suggested that the IRB, or the Integrated Rail Body, as described in the bill, means the end of GBR. But our reading is that the IRB and GBR are probably one and the same thing. Is that right? Will GBR be the new trading name of the IRB?
Absolutely. I think I listened to the podcast last week and Richard got it bang on the money. Like, it's a brand name. And once something's in primary legislation, you need primary legislation to replace it. So it would be a bit daft to put a brand name into primary legislation and then require an act of parliament if you wanted to change it. So GBR is absolutely the integrated rail body with a name that a previous prime minister was particularly fond of putting out there, but which, look, has got some traction. The Labour Party are coming up with Great British Energy and things like that as well, aren't they? So it may or may not last as a name, but the IRB is GBR. Anyone who tries to draw a distinction that, there's nothing to see there. And that's
okay. Okay, that's really clear. And I get the point about primary legislation. That makes it perfectly clear. The other thing that the DfT said, though, that Network Rail Infrastructure Limited, which is the holder of the network license, will become the IRB. Yep. And since that's going to be called GBR in future, for the reasons you've just said, does that, to all intents and purposes, mean that at some point the Network Rail brand will disappear, or is that not yet decided?
Yeah. No, absolutely means that. I mean, there'd be no point in keeping a Network Rail brand. I think it's there's a couple of things in there, isn't there? I mean, I'm happy to go on to talk, and I think it's important we understand why it's being thrown out of Network Rail, because I think some people are seeing sort of dragons there, and
I think that would be great if you could, yeah.
But like, first, there'd be no logic to keeping the Network Rail brand, because the whole point about the integrated rail body is the I word. It's for the first time since 1994. It's bringing together the franchising powers, both letting and management, with infrastructure management. So there's no need for Network Rail to exist. And moreover, Network Rail shouldn't exist. I've been very explicit for several years, as is now Lord Hendy, that our aims were to be the last chair and chief executive of Network Rail, because we believe an integrated model is a better model. Now, in which case, then why vest this in Network Rail? Pure practicalities. Network Rail has 40,000 employees, hundreds of thousands of assets, billions of pounds of liabilities, thousands of contracts. And if you create an entirely new entity, you have to go through all of the rigmarole to transfer all of those people, contracts, assets into that new entity. By using the corporate body, which is Network Rail, you streamline the process. And for heaven's sake, the last thing our railway needs is unnecessary process, it seems to be. We've got way too much of it as it is. So that's why it's been Network Rail. It doesn't mean that Network Rail management are automatically the management of GBR. It doesn't mean that Network Rail culture is GBR culture, although it is an inevitable reality that when you've got a job the size of Network Rail, that we will bring some of that culture in, and there's unfinished business about changing the culture of Network Rail. But integration is the single biggest thing we can do about that, and that's something I'm really, really passionate about.
Okay, well, we'll come on to integration a bit in a while, because, as you say, that and culture are critical.
Yeah.
But are we potentially getting slightly ahead of ourselves anyway, right? Because, I mean, what chance is there really of getting this into primary legislation between now and the general election? I mean, I think even the Secretary of State has cast some, understandable doubt on that. So we're going through pre-legislative scrutiny. That's fine. But is there a risk that this just gets to a general election, it's not carried over, and it dies, and we're back to square one?
So, look, I don't think it's contentious to say the presumption is it probably won't be in legislation before the next election. That's why pre-legislative scrutiny is a way of maintaining momentum. But look, a week is a long time in politics, is the saying, isn't it? And if this bill passes relatively straightforwardly through pre-legislative scrutiny, and Parliament goes on till its limits, it's entirely possible that it could happen. Now, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I wouldn't be putting a lot of money on that. I think, Secretary of State's been pretty clear on that. But it does help us in, I think, three very significant ways. First of all, it sets out that there is a bill and that we are, dare I say, quotes, haven't ready for a legislative slot. Secondly, it gives us some reassurance to a sector that is profoundly unstable at the moment, be given what has happened right since the Williams Review began, and then what COVID has done, and the temporary contractual arrangements. And thirdly, it allows us to flesh out any issues which are in the bill and people, manage people's expectations and pick things up. So I think the bill is really powerful for those three reasons. But it absolutely isn't a free pass to straight to legislation under this government. Will it survive a new government? Well, I think all the parties recognise that the railway can't stay in stasis for a very long time. Consumers are suffering, freight users are suffering, the taxpayer is suffering, the private sector is suffering. We're not getting done what we want to do in an efficient way. Now, there's still lots of really good things happening, lots of investment in the system, lots of people busting their gut to deliver for passengers, but we're not as good as we should be because of that uncertainty. So whatever happens at the election, I'm confident it will be a priority to move on with reform. Whether or not it'll be the number one priority, of course, will depend upon who the government is, but also their wider political context.
I mean, why is it taken so long? Why is it taken so long to publish this? I mean, reading the bill with the best will in the world, it's not the most complex piece of legislation. Some of the implementation might be, and some of the transitional arrangements might be, but the actual bill's not that complex. Why so long?
Well, look, the bill has been slimmed down to make it more manageable, to try and get a parliamentary slot, which is a bit ironic. Well, if I was being slightly facetious, I'd say, have you lived out of the country for the last 3 years, Richard? Keith Williams, and it's not just a few years, Keith Williams largely finished his work by the end of 2019. Grant Shapps understandably wanted to get his mind around things, but he'd only been in post months. COVID came along. That added a good year or so to it. White paper published in 2021. And we had a bill then announced in the June 22 Queen's Speech, which was about the first opportunity, realistically, to get a bill through the program. Of course, then what happened in July 2022 was Boris Johnson resigned. We then have we have a leadership election uncertainty. We have a very short premiership from Liz Truss, where it's not part of her legislative programme. And then you've got a new government, and then you've got a new Secretary of State. And then what's happened is you're running out of road in the legislative programme. So I don't see any conspiracy theories. I don't see dragons, but absolutely political events have meant that this bill, which is relatively straightforward, I think relatively non-contentious. There are some wings at either end of the main political parties that may have issue with it, but generally speaking, I think there's quite a broad consensus behind it. But it has just got lost in that political maelstrom that has affected quite a lot of our public life, hasn't it, in the last 3 years?
I mean, Richard was right to say that the Secretary of State was uncertain. In fact, he said he thinks it's unlikely that this is going to be passed by the election. I mean, I suppose you've got to say, why was it done at all? Is the government serious about it, Andrew, or are they just wanting to be seen to be doing something or throw a curveball to Labour, perhaps?
I think the government are serious about it because they know they can't carry on as they are. They can't. if they believe in private sector participation, then they need a new contracting model. Train operators are still on very short-term contracts with very short-term incentives. So if you believe in that model, you need to have the underpinning architecture right to give the market confidence in a new contract. So that's one reason. Secondly, the Prime Minister has been very clear about the railway needs to cut its costs. And I think there's compelling evidence that an integrated railway will do that more effectively than a segregated railway with all the friction costs that comes from that. And there are undoubtedly areas where we're not making progress. Look, this is a bit of name dropping, but unusually I was with the Prime Minister yesterday, and we were talking about stations, and we were talking about electrification, and I said, look, these things would happen quicker and more cheaply in a simplified structure. And that is the overwhelming lesson that I have learnt from being chief executive of Network Rail. There are too many actors in too many things who act in their own interests. And that, I know people have referenced my comments after the 7th of December horror at Ladbroke Grove, with the OLE derailment. But it's true of so much of what we do in the system now. We've reached a point where the friction cost outweighs the benefit of vertical separation. And that's why I think it's right now. I was a massive fan of franchising. The best job I have ever done in my life was running Southwest Trains when Richard was chairman of the SRA. Because we were making good profits, we had good owners, we had light touch oversight, we knew what we wanted to do, and we made big consumer changes. Shareholders were looked after. We made we didn't duck the unions. We had difficult conversations. No, we did a lot of things progressively, but those times have passed. Those circumstances are no longer there, and we've got to a stage where the friction costs are so much greater now than the benefits you get from separation. That's my analysis.
We'll almost certainly come back to those friction costs, because it's a very fair point. The cost, transactional boundaries and all the rest of it. But just picking up on that private sector point, when you read the rail reform bill, I mean, it did sort of leap out at me for certain that the first thing that's in there after the usual sort of guff that introduces it is that Section 2 says there'll be a job to, one of the obligations that the integrated rail body, GBR, will have is to produce a business plan. And then the second thing was, and then a report explaining how well you've done increasing the role of the private sector. And there's lots and lots of references to private sector. Now, look, I'm a kind of a child of the private sector as well, in a way, given background. So I'm not making a kind of a public-private point, but it was telling just how... Well, it was just very upfront. It was almost like, do you know what? It was almost like a little bit goading Labour, because they've made such a thing about national, publicly owned. Why so much emphasis, do you think, on the private sector so early on?
So I genuinely don't think it's goading Labour so much as reassuring the Conservatives in government. If you think about it, creating a new national body, right, is not a natural thing. It's not a natural big C Conservative policy.
That's fair.
And this is one of the reasons why it's taken us time to convince consecutive secretaries of state that it's the right thing to do. Because
so he's throwing red meat to his party right then, Andrew.
Yeah, well, it's to people who want concern that this isn't going to become some big natural monolithic body. And I think, look, wherever you are on the private-public spectrum, I think we would all agree we do not want to create a big monolithic and clunky bureaucratic organisation over my dead body. It's one of the reasons why I've been starting to sow the seeds of devolution as one of the antidotes to any big national monolithic body. So I think it's an entirely rational, reasonable reassurance to people in the Conservative Party, in the governing party, that there will be a strong role for the private sector under this model.
I mean, Richard's right. I was taken aback by that when I read it as well, because what I was expecting it to say, that there would be an annual report to demonstrate the progress made in delivering a better service.
I think that's the business plan,
But
though,
it
to be
doesn't
honest,
say
Nigel.
that, does it? It says about to the private sector, goes on and on about open access and encouraging it, as the minister did at the Bradshaw address the other day, when open access is a tiny part of the overall passenger business.
Well, open access is a small part of the passenger business. Again, you talk as to an ex-chairman of Hull Trains, so I'm somebody who believes in open access operators. I've seen the value of them.
Didn't say I didn't believe in them, Andrew.
No, but you're right. They're relatively niche, and I was
Yeah.
explaining this to somebody quite recently. There aren't that many flows, A to B flows, that are really, really attractive to open access operators. And guess what? There's not a lot of spare capacity on those flows. So, the innate characteristics of railways make it hard for there to be a large, particularly on a mixed traffic, heavily used railway like the UK's railway. It's not natural territory for big open access. But I think it provides a real purpose. It provides quite a dynamic, innovative edge. It provides choice for certain routes. When Hull, for example, at Grand Central Sunderland, it's really connecting people in. But I think But I think the point of the way the bill is drafted is it goes beyond that to actually how are you going to facilitate private sector participation in the railway for that reason. And I think to your point about how you improve in the system, that's very much in the business plan. That's what the purpose of the business plan.
Okay.
How you deliver against the balanced objectives that the Secretary of State will set, and indeed what's in the license.
Okay. Yep, I get that point, Richard.
We believe you. You mentioned we talked about franchising. You talked about integrating almost like the franchising authority with the infrastructure operator. One thing I suspect that there will be, relief bordering on joy, will be the notion that the franchise management role will move from the DFT to Great British Railways as the commissioning authority. Less clear, though, is how that's actually going to be implemented. I presume TUPE will apply, because all the guys at the DFT, guys and girls, have got contracts of employment. So TUPE will apply, and I guess they're going to transfer over to GBR. Are you looking forward to welcoming Peter Wilkinson, the managing director of passenger rail from the DFT to the GBR senior team?
Now, there's a thought.
There's some brilliant talent in DFT. And the thing about TUPE is it's a right to the employee. It's not it's not an obligation. And I suspect a number of the people who are currently doing this work in the DFT will say, actually, my career is in the civil service, and so I don't want to transfer. And others will say, I love the railway. I did this job because I really want to work as part of the railway, and they will transfer. And look, we're all going to have to change culture and behaviours as part of this, because the vast majority of us, apart from old lags like myself, have never worked in a joined-up system. This is one of our challenges about train performance, cost efficiency. Very, very few people left in the sector now have actually ran or even been part of an integrated railway. I talk about it, but I was a very junior manager. When I was doing this, I wasn't a senior manager, in my 20s. And so we're all going to have to change behaviours, ways of thinking for that. But what I see is some brilliant people in the DFT who are really committed to that. And I also see some people who will say, actually, my choice is to stay within Department for Transport. I'm just passing through DFT. My own daughter happened to do 18 months in the DFT, and she's now moved on to Department of Business and Trade, and she was in health before that, and she's only just starting her career in the civil service. There's that mix of people there.
I have to say, I think when you've done with Network Rail, and I really hope it's going to be a long while yet, there's a role for you in the United Nations, Andrew.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
It's very, very rare that I'm given the qualities of diplomacy, Richard. So I'm obviously on my behaviour. Those Brilliant. Who work closely with me say I am deeply undiplomatic. So, yeah.
Brilliant.
Well, sometimes you have to bang heads together, don't you, Andrew? Thank you for that. Neatly sidestepped about Peter Wilkinson. We'll not put you on the spot about it.
I don't think I sidestepped that at all. If Peter wants to join, then we would love having Peter's skills, and we'd love training Peter in some new skills. Because like me, none of us are the perfect article for this new entity.
Indeed not. Nicely answered. Nicely answered. But seriously, how are we going to change the culture, which is the most difficult thing to do? You've made great store of GBR not being Network Rail 2.0, and that is not only understandable but eminently sensible. You've been right about that.
Yeah.
But when staff 2P across, it's going to tie your hands a bit, isn't it?
Well, it will initially, but I think the point, look, why does Network Rail have the culture it has? It does because it's been an entirely rational response to the incentives that are placed before it in the current construct. Asset managers who are utterly, who are held entirely harmless from passenger or freight volumes, regulatory targets which value asset age, not market utilization of asset. There are loads of reasons why I meet fantastic people in Network Rail who are absolutely the very best. They're world-class people, and they have responded to a whole set of incentives, right, in certain ways. And by the way, we're not alone in that. There are other parts of the businesses that do that. So I think the single biggest thing we can do to change culture is to change that incentive and mechanism. One of the things I'm most proud of, partly because it got Roger Ford to write a nice article about GBRTP, and I thought I would die before that day arose, was about the whole P&L model that we're doing. For the first time since 1994, we can produce a 4-weekly model of the industry P&L and show costs and revenues and start to give people visibility of that information. That will change culture much, much more quickly than exhortations or team building events or, tree hugging, because most of us are rational actors and we respond to the information we have and the incentives that people place before us. So I'm a much, much more positive about the opportunity to change culture. And it's also why I'm so passionate about the future can't be Network Rail, because Network Rail is an infrastructure body. It delivers service, but it looks after the assets and it has no exposure to the revenues of the system. And that is a profound error, in my view, if you want to optimize a system. It worked well for a period of time when the railways were in decline or were soon to be declined, or when there was lots of low-hanging fruit. But we
So
now
not only you've confirmed that GBR is not going to be trashed, which some people have been suggesting. It's still also clearly then equally not true that the new GBR, the IBR, will use the infrastructure bits of Network Rail, but it is wrong to be seen Network Rail as taking over, which other people have suggested.
1,000%. That would be criminal. I want no part to play in a new GBR that's a version of Network Rail. Network Rail infrastructure management is critical. Look at the weather. We've just had the wettest February in 268 years. We've got to get a grip of those infrastructure issues if you want to run a decent train service. However brilliant your customer service, however brilliant your rolling stock, if the track isn't open, so if you should, I don't want to denigrate the role of infrastructure management, but the corporate body Network Rail, with the incentives, the contractual incentives, the contractual restrictions, and the behaviours that drive, are the exact opposite of what GBR needs to be. Single P&L, whole system thinking. That is the essence. That's why I'm such a believer in GBR. That's why I've stuck with it. I've been chief executive of Network Rail now longer than anyone else. And it's because I believe that GBR is a better way to do business in the 2020s in Britain's railways.
But let's go back to that point you made about transaction costs and friction, right? Because in the Department for Transport's press release, it says, when established, GBR will be the new franchising authority, contracting with the private sector to deliver passenger services. Okay, so contracting.
Yeah.
It goes on to talk about the reforms will improve connectivity. It will encourage more open access operators. So that's more contracts in terms of track. I take your point, there won't be that many of them, but nonetheless, that's a contract.
They're to be encouraged.
Indeed. And then it also says the plans will deliver better service by bringing track and train together. Hang on a minute. We're going to have franchises. We're going to be contracting with the private sector. We've got interfaces. We've got transactional costs. We've got friction. We've probably got more of them. And we're bringing track and train together. Those two kind of concepts don't seem to stack up.
I can see why it may appear like that at first glance, but I think they do stack up. Look, and if if you had my esteemed chairman here, Lord Hendy, he would say most people using London buses have no idea who is the service provider. The fact that it's contracted to the private sector is largely unseen to the users of the bus network in London. You can contract with the private sector without all of the complexity, and that is partly because what revenue the operating model of the railways, in the early 1990s was about minimizing this level of subsidy that was being paid, and the way you did that was to compete franchises. And this is not for your benefit, this is for listeners' benefits, for maybe you're not quite one of the two, three of us. Sorry.
It's all right, Andrew. I'm enjoying it as well.
And the model was said, right, you concentrate all the subsidy in operators, and then you compete that operation, and you lower the subsidy. And if you grow some revenue, then great. Of course, what actually happened was revenue growth partly because of the private sector participation, but more because of the explosion in the population numbers, the city centre to city centre economy, all meant that the revenue element of that contract became really, really important. As that became more and more important, the contractual matrix froze because you couldn't change anything. You must have seen this when you were at the SRA, Richard. You daren't open up a contract. You daren't vary a contract because you opened up the revenue line. And the minute you open up the revenue line, you're suddenly in a single tender negotiation, and you've lost all the benefits of that competitive process. So if you don't have revenue risk at the heart of your contract, it's much easier to be flexile, to be much more adaptive in the commercial arrangement. Yeah.
So this is really interesting there. So back to Peter Hendy's model, example of the buses. One of the things about London buses, when you win a contract for one, then they're all red, right? They've all got an LT roundel on them. So what we're describing here a world where the GBR franchises or concessions will be unified brand. You won't really be able to tell who's operating it. It will just be a private sector contractor against a unified brand a la London buses.
Well, look, that's not in the bill at all. And that will be absolutely for development by GBR and whoever leads GBR. And I am not for a nanosecond assuming that I will have a role in that. I'll be very.
But you're not ruling that out as a model.
I'm not ruling it out, but I think there's a spectrum, there's a continuum, right? And okay. I think it works for London buses. I would not be arguing that necessarily for long distance intercity services, where you'd want people to have more opportunity to intervene, more incentive to grow revenue, but without all the panoply and straitjacket that comes with full revenue risk. What I'm against is full revenue risk, because I think it brought more restriction, particularly on a congested network and a network where you're putting billions of pounds of public money into growth. And what I'm saying, at one end, if you like, you've got the bus concession, everything's single unified. At the other end, you've got revenue risk. I think there's a range of different contracting models. Certainly Keith Williams envisaged that. They don't all have to be the same. I would probably, if I was in charge, rule out both of those extremes. Full revenue risk comes with too much pain. And actually, by the way, there are no bidders for it. One of the things we're having to persuade Treasury of, that, however attractive that might seem, there is no market for that now for a whole host of reasons, which we could go into another time. And at the other end, I'm not sure, given Metro mayors, for example, I'm not sure Andy Street and Andy Burnham will want the GBR telling them what colour their trains are painted. And I'm not hung up about that. But consistency of some standards, some consistency of underlying brand importance, so the consumer knows who's accountable. But I think, particularly given the power of devolved administrations, we're going to see variety, and I think variety is good in that sense.
So, 50 Shades of franchising then.
Well, not why do we have to land on one perfect model? Let's this is a sector which is already back to 10, 11 billion pounds of turnover, which was unimaginable when the railway model was privatized 30 years ago. Let's hope it's up to 13, 14 in the next 5, 10 years. We do not need a single model. Why impose that straitjacket on us? That was part of the problem with the old model.
One size does not fit all. Guide in mind and direct in mind, Andrew, because I noticed Stephen Morgan in his rather limp speech at the Bradshaw address the other night referenced several times a guide in mind. Now, in the aftermath of the dewirement at Paddington on 8th of December, which you just mentioned, you said, importantly, we've failed as a system. Too many individual actors seeing risk from their own perspective meant it was harder than it should have been to get things done whilst maintaining safety.
Well, actually, you went further, didn't you? Because you also said we've gone backwards in customer service.
Yeah.
And this was a really great. We've not had a chance to speak about this until now, so I've always wanted to know what you meant by this. You said tools to look after passengers that you, because you were obviously stuck on this, that I would have used as a station manager in 1987 before I'd even seen a mobile phone were not available, and we were hardly great at it then. So that's fascinating. I wonder if you may explain what you meant by that. But we're worried about this guiding mind. Guiding mind sounds, listen, it's quite soft touch. It's quite standoffish, potentially. I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth, right? Whereas a directing mind, which is, right, you do that, and you do that. Too many actors, we're not going to have that. We're going to have one, and we're going to organise it. Surely you want a directing mind.
I'm not sure what the real differences are. All right, it partly depends on influence and how well you guide, don't you? You know,
okay.
You can guide from the front, you can guide from behind, you can guide from the side. And look, the key is this is going to be the contracting authority. So actually, it's in contract. A lot of this stuff you do not need to tell. But I don't want to. I think it would be particularly in the early years of GBR, to say there's only one source of wisdom on everything, and therefore the only model we can do is to really direct people, I think would be profoundly wrong. There's huge talent across the sector. There are people who need to be empowered to do some good things, but within some principles. And I think you can set some of the direction in those contracts in a way that the current contracts don't. We don't currently allow people to do some of the right things.
But surely on December the 8th, Andrew, it did need a direct in mind, exactly what Richard said. Somebody saying, you do this, you do that, and you do that.
Well, let me give you an example, right? Steve Montgomery and I were sat down with the Avanti West Coast and the Network Rail region team looking at what we could do to improve Avanti West Coast performance last Friday, I think it was, and we've got Avanti got a control in Birmingham. We've got a control in Rugby. Avanti train crew are managed from Preston. We've got another control then in Manchester. The coordination of those things is pretty catastrophic at the moment. I would, frankly, as part of a new contract for running West Coast and due coast, we would want to rationalise that. So you're not direct. You're actually saying, look, as part of our terms of contracting, we want to understand how you're going to manage that. So you set very clear parameters for simplified command and control. So I think we shouldn't get too hung up on. I'm not a laissez-faire. I believe the railway actually requires command and control at some key points. And one of the things we've got to work through is how in real time we get over an irrational obsession with your own personal liability or your corporate liability trumping the right end state and the right outcome for passengers. I think we can do that via contract and via industry structures. The extent to which, actually, there'll be quite a lot of direction, but it will be in contract as opposed to Big Brother pointing to everybody, you do that, you do that, you do that, in real time, as some sort of Uber fat controller, because there's too many tough decisions. The other thing I've learned from Network Rail is there's always something going on. And if you try and create some large body that's telling everybody exactly what they do, and you emaciate people and you disempower them by being directed and waiting for direction. No, I'm on a rant now, and but forgive me. But one of the things that really
Andrew.
When I came back into the sector, having had 10 years out, was we've become victims. We've become victims of systems, processes, contracts, DFT, and we sometimes think it's enough to explain why we couldn't do something. And my worry is the language of directing, if we're not careful, encourages people again to become a passive respondent. I'm absolutely with you about control in mind in real time, about setting clear expectations, but let's not effectively write off the thoughts, ideas, ingenuity of a vast majority of people because they're not able to direct. That's the sensitivity I have around that, not
Okay.
readiness of one person to take charge in the moments when it's really needed.
You just said something there which is really interesting, has grabbed my attention, and that's a bit use of language and all the rest of it. If there's one aspect of today's railway which drives me demented, it's the minute you suggest something, the tendency is to come up with explain all the reasons why you can't do it. Oh no, we can't do this because of that. We can't do it because of safety. We can't do it because of the regulator. I've never known a management structure be more half empty rather than half full.
We've created that's exactly what we've created by all the complexity, all the second guessing, all the constraints of contract, all the rights of veto. Last week we just we did the resignaling well in Hitchin, which is our first mainline digital signaling capability. The signals that are there on that track are only there temporarily until we've completed it. The complexity of doing digital signaling, moving signal from track to train in the existing structure is as close to impossible as anything I've ever encountered in my life. The number of people who can veto it, obstruct it, game it, commercialize it is phenomenal. And they're all acting rationally, by the way. Not bad people. People you and I would happily have a pint with and call a mate separately, but their current contract and the industry structures mean that they're incentivized to look after their own interests. And
too many actors
acting rationally in a very, very dysfunctional
narrow way. Yeah. Well, good luck with all that, Andrew. You've completely got us. You've completely got us on side with that. I hate all that. I mean, you even see it on social media. I make a mention of I don't like trains being shut up in platforms and making people queue up to get on. And there's 100 reasons why it's the right thing to do, and you can't do it. There's no sense of let's get together and sort this rather than explain why we can't do it. Anyway, now I'm having a rant, so I better shut up. In the DFT, don't say a word, Bowker. In the DFT's press release, it says rather grandly, I might say, that the Rail Reform Bill will, when passed, help deliver on the 2019 manifesto commitment by bringing forward the biggest rail reform programme in a generation to create a simpler, more effective rail system. What say you, Richard?
Well, I read that and went, okay. And Andrew, you've explained some of the reasons why you think it is quite more transformative than that. But there's quite a lot in this rail reform bill that's not mentioned. Really quite surprised there's nothing in about the ORR. Okay, so ORR kind of stays as is. No real moves to a vertically integrated solution. It's very much by contract. And you've just described why the contracts are going to be different. When you kind of sit back and read it, you go, is it actually fair to say it's the biggest reform in a generation? Because there's an awful lot of this that's not actually getting touched.
Well, look, it's a pretty low bar, isn't it?
Okay, touche.
That was the easiest question I've been asked in a long time. In the sense, we haven't had much. We haven't had. Look, it's the systematic reform because this is it. The contract. One of my big bear bugs is you look at Schedule 8, right? Pulled as a mechanism, a really quite a smart mechanism, pulled together by some smart people in 1993, 1994, to compensate operators for revenue losses, not to drive improvements in performance. But the point is, it had a threshold of delay investigation of 3 minutes. 30 years on, technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data mining, we've still got that threshold because everything's designed around that contract. Those contracts have been set in stone. So it is quite transformational because it enables that. I happen to agree with you that I think to not deal with regulation at all is a mistake. As the infrastructure manager, I am passionate about the role of the regulator, both in allowing the infrastructure to have an independent assessment that isn't subject to the vagaries of annual Treasury changes and being held to account for that. But I do think there are areas where the OR have been asked to do things which will not be necessary in the future or could be better done differently. That's not a criticism of the OR. It's saying The tasks that you have currently got, some of them will be superfluous, but we can deal with those in good time. And lots of those are not primary legislation dependent. They are secondary
Okay,
legislation.
we could use statutory instruments. Look, I'm delighted that was the easiest question you've been asked for a long time. Let me then ask it this way then.
Much trickier one, I thought.
No. It's the same question in a slightly different way. So when Alistair Darling abolished the Strategic Rail Authority and did what he did in 2004, he said, and I'm doing this, it's the last time we'll need to do this for 20 years, for a generation. And since then, we've had the Brown Review, the McNulty Review, we've had the Eddington Review, we've had the Williams Review.
The Hendy Review.
The Hendy, well, actually, millions of them, right? How do people know that this time it's going to stick?
Going to be forever.
Well, I think because none of those got anywhere near legislation, right? None of those actually got to a white paper. I think what you were quite disparaging, Nigel, about the Bradshaw address, but what was very clear, one of the reasons it was a bit disappointing is because there was quite a lot of common ground between the two. It was a bit of a love fest for a moment or two, wasn't it, between Hugh and Stephen?
Well,
because there's actually a lot of interface between the two.
I said Morgan's speech was a bit limp, and it was.
Okay. Well, look, I'm not going to comment on that because the minister has an army of officials behind him, and a shadow rail minister, is a much sort of leaner task, isn't it? So the fact that we don't have a stable contracting model means that if a Conservative government or Conservative-led coalition or any form of government which wants to maintain the private sector will need to do something differently after the next election. And if a Labour government that doesn't believe in the role of the private sector wants to do something after the election, it's going to need to do something as well. And I think at the heart of GBR, bringing track and train together, is a kernel that's completely consistent of both of those models. And that's why I think it's not everything you want by any means, but it's a really good foundation to what we need to do.
Okay. Well, look, we're pretty much running out of time fairly rapidly, Andrew. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to get in or have a bit of a rant about?
That is the easiest question ever, right? That was the easiest.
Well, it is because I listened to your last podcast, and Richard talked about throwing the boulder in about maybe we can't afford to do reform because train service delivery should be our
do nothing
focus.
For you and just sort it out.
Yeah, and I thought it posed a really interesting question, which I guess is what Richard was intending to do, and hopefully wasn't thinking about literally, because part of me thinks that the very last thing the industry needs to do is be distracted. But of course, where I think you were wrong, which is the industry is distracted. Williams has been there. There's been the promise. If you're an operator, you're on a temporary contract, which the vast majority of which expire next year. So I think it's a false scenario to suggest you've got stability over here if we don't talk about reform, which allows us to concentrate on running a railway. Secondly, one of the reasons why we've hit a block on train service performance is because of that contractual matrix, is because of all the impediments to getting those things right. And by the way, it's going to be at more risk unless we sort some of the inefficiencies in the system. A government under fiscal pressure will look to do things which harm performance. So in those two areas, I think you're wrong. Where I violently agree with you is it's got to be our number one and number two and number three focus. A reliable timetable delivered safely is what the railway does. It's our product. Yeah. And if we're not doing that, we're not offering our product in the best way. Now, we've got to stop talking down train service performance because on a lot of the measures, actually, it's pretty good at the moment. But we are terrible on bad days and there are far too many cancellations. So I'm not remotely complacent. I think there are lots of areas where we could say people are doing better now than pre-COVID, where the improvement trajectory is good, but too many cancellations and too much disruption because of this, principally because of bad weather, but also in terms of one-off events. So the essence, I completely agree with you. We must never lose sight of that delivery issue. What I don't do is agree that somehow we'd be better at that if we pretended there wasn't the uncertainty of reform. That is a reality that we have to live with, and we've got to fix it because it's key to the long-term effectiveness, prosperity, and growth of the railway that I know we all love.
Well, that's brilliant, Andrew. I'm just making a mental note to get Steph to clip the bit that says that's where you're wrong, Richard.
Well, I was once.
and put it on a loop. I might even get Steph to do it for me
I
for a
gave him the
ringtone.
credit of putting it out there because it is the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Yeah,
It is. Yeah. But look, that is all we got time for today.
For good intentions. Yeah.
I'm really sorry. It is all we got time for. Andrew, we could talk for hours. And indeed, we'd really love to invite you back when you've got some time and explore so many of the other aspects of the railway. So we hope that we'll see you again before too long. But yeah, I hope we can have you back on before too long, Andy. I'm really impressed to hear you talk, because you've had a fairly rough few years, as you say. You've done that job longer than anybody else. So to sit here and watch you speaking with such passion and enthusiasm and go get them, I'm sure Richard will agree, is really good.
Yeah, it's been superb. It's
really good to see. So, more power to your elbow, and do give our regards to the Lord Hendy. And we must have him on here as well before. Indeed. Yes, before too long.
You have to, we don't. Right, that's fine.
But for now, thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. Till the next time.
Thank you both.
Cheers, Andrew.
Well, Richard and I and Steph hope you really enjoyed that conversation with Andrew Haines as much as we did, really. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, as well as leave any comments on today's show on YouTube or wherever you normally contact us, through the website or emails. And plus, very importantly, this is a 2-pod week, so don't forget to tune into our weekly magazine show, which will be published tomorrow, Thursday, the 29th of February. Oh, leap year day, I hadn't realised that. 29th of Feb. When we will reflect a little more on today's discussion with Andrew, as well as chat about the announcement on the 26th of February that £4.7 billion will allegedly be given to the North and Midlands to spend on local transport schemes, all from monies said to be saved from cancelling HS2. Or are things not at first what they might seem at first? We'll hopefully dig into that. Tune in tomorrow to find out. But for now, it's goodbye from me and...
Goodbye from me.
Thanks for joining us.